Hi, this is Usman Malik of LondonLawTutor.com. This introductory podcast is on the tort of negligence. At the outset, I want to clarify one thing, which I believe is quite important in order to gain a fundamental understanding of what the law of tort is about. Whereas the criminal law serves a purpose to punish an offender who's committed a criminal offense, like theft, murder, etc. The purpose of the law of tort is to compensate a victim of a wrong, of a civil wrong. The tort of negligence in particular is very important because it allows people in different situations to be owed a duty of care by any particular defendant whose actions are in question in front of the court. And it all started with the case of Donoghue and Stevenson, and that decision really led to the development of the tort of negligence as an overarching umbrella sort of principle, underpinning the whole of tort law. And it was Lord Atkin in the summer of 1932 when he started to contemplate the neighbor principle. And basically the neighbor principle is that anyone who can be affected in an adverse way by my actions, I ought to have under my contemplation, and I ought to take reasonable care to ensure that my actions don't affect that person in a way that either damages their property or injures them, and so on and so forth. And it was in the decision of Donoghue and Stevenson, the famous case where there was a snail in the ginger beer of Mrs. Donoghue, and she sued the ultimate manufacturer of the ginger beer. And at that time, the contract fallacy theory was that, well, you can't sue the ultimate manufacturer. And that is what was abolished in this case, and which eventually led to the development of the tort of negligence. And the most important case I would suggest to establishing a duty of care in a novel situation is Caparo Industries against Dickman PLC. And that decision basically has a three-part test for us to establish whether there is a duty of care owed to the claimant. And that has foreseeability as one element, proximity, and just, fair, and reasonable to impose liability. So if these three things are satisfied, then you can establish the first part of the tort of negligence, which is that the claimant needs to prove that they are owed a duty of care. And once that is established, then you can move on to the other elements, as we shall discuss. But it is important to keep in mind that in some situations, a duty of care is recognized by the law. For example, doctor-patient, lawyer-client, and so on and so forth. The second part would be the most important element, that the duty of care that is owed has been breached. And that, breach is very important from the perspective of the court, because in order to compensate the claimant, if that duty of care was not breached, then the question of whether that breach caused the harm suffered by the claimant does not arise. So in order to move on to the third element of causation, we need to satisfy whether there was breach. And there are certain factors the court takes into account here as well. For example, was there a degree of risk? Was there seriousness of harm? Was it practicable to take precautions against that harm occurring? And what was the social utility if any, of the defendant's actions. So all of these factors, which is a non-exhaustive list, would be taken into account by the court. And breach by Professor Fleming has been defined as the conduct falling below the standard required for the protection of others from unreasonable risk of harm. So Professor Fleming has defined a breach as that. And then you move on to the other elements of causation, where the but-for test applies. And then you have to also, there has to be a link between the breach and the harm suffered. That's causation for you. And once that is satisfied and there's no break in the chain of causation through intervening causes, then you can move on to remoteness, which is the question that whether that type or kind of harm was foreseeable on the facts. So I hope this basic introduction to the different elements of the tort of negligence has shed some light and given you a somewhat of a useful insight on how this tort operates and why it's so fundamentally important to compensate people. Well, we'll have more areas of law coming soon on our YouTube channel, and I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.